lost in this conversation. Let's turn this thing on, see if it's in tune. Hello, this is Leland, and this is the third episode of Lost in Conversation. Today I want to share with you a recent conversation I had with the historian Richard Drake. In very broad terms, the topic of this conversation is the decline of historical study in America, but I think it pretty squarely confronts some of the more critical ideas facing modern America in our time. Richard and I have known one another since I was an undergraduate student in the history program at the University of Montana. In 1990, my second year in college, I took a class on the history of terrorism from him, and the following semester I added history as a major. I took every class Richard taught between 1990 and 1995 when I left the university. Richard is an historian of both Europe and the United States. He undertook graduate work in American history at Brown University and UC Santa Barbara and earned his PhD at UCLA in 1976 with a specialty in European history. He taught history at UCLA, UC Irvine, Wellesley College, Princeton University, and New York University before joining the University of Montana History Department in 1982. He's the author of 6, soon to be 7 books, the first 4 of which focus on various topics in Italian history, particularly on terrorism and political extremism in 19th and 20th century Italy. In 2013, his attention refocused on America with his book The Education of an Anti-Imperialist, Robert La Follette and U.S. Expansion, and that was followed by his book Charles Austin Beard, Return of the Master Historian of American Imperialism in 2018. He recently completed a book about the historian William Appleman Williams, which will be published soon. Since 2017, he has served as the Lucille Spear Research Chair in Politics and History at the University of Montana. This conversation references a number of books. You'll find a complete list of all the referenced works, as well as links to Richard's website and a bibliography of his books in the show notes. Richard, please introduce yourself.
My name is Richard Drake. I teach history at the University of Montana. My interests touch mainly on European history and American history. I publish in both of those fields, and I'm very much looking forward to talking with you today about our shared interests in the decline of historical studies in America and what is behind that very negative trend.
There's a lot of information that shows that there's a decline in the number of undergraduate degrees being conferred in history. There is a decline in faculty appointments. I would say this is troubling. And I think you as a professor of history would agree that this is troubling. Is this surprising?
I don't think it's surprising in view of the changes in the workplace, the changes in the economy, the changes produced by technology. Students, in order to prepare for employment once they graduate, are more and more taking STEM subjects, not the traditional humanities. The traditional humanities enrollments, as you pointed out, student enrollments, faculty appointments are in a sharp decline. And as I say, there are current economic, technological factors driving that process. But I want to point out that these trends that we're so worried about today in 2025 had been a long time forming. And one of our greatest economists and sociologists, Thurston Veblen, in 1918, in a classic book, The Higher Learning in America, warned the American people that some very severe changes would be taking place in higher learning, that the university culture would be undergoing a transformation because of the increased role of businessmen, business interests in higher education, particularly on boards of trustees. This he found to be a very worrisome development because of what it surely was going to lead to, he thought, in 1918. I actually started writing that book about 10 years before it was actually published. So, I mean, going back almost to the beginning of the 20th century, Veblen was pretty sure that a revolution was underway in university instruction, in university culture, and that more and more the university would be dedicated to job training and to research with what he called a pecuniary incentive to it. And that the traditional idea of a university, that the idea that John Henry, now Saint Newman, in his classic book of the 1850s, The Idea of a University, as a training ground for the mind, to establish canons of taste and judgment in the thinking of the educated people who would be setting the tone for society. All that was about to be drastically reduced in importance.
In favor of vocational training.
Vocational training. And I think the other point to make in this regard is that this is not just an American problem. These trends that we're talking about are taking place internationally. I should mention that I have a special interest in Italy for a long time focus of my research. And even there in that country, the cradle of the humanistic tradition, where Francesco Petrarca and the other humanists of the 14th century launched the humanistic credo education. Even there, the humanities are in free fall. Student enrollments, those trends that you mentioned at the beginning, free fall in student enrollments in courses, also faculty appointments, all those trends are taking place outside the United States as well as inside. So it's an international problem. I find it fascinating that Veblen saw all of this taking place more than 100 years ago, and I think his genius as a prophet has been confirmed by what is going on today.
But it didn't just fall on deaf ears for 100 years until suddenly we woke up in the 21st century with the problems that we have. I mean, Richard Hofstadter has a strong argument in his book, which I believe was 1963.
Yeah.
That criticizes how American education has been shaped by vocationalism and utilitarianism rather than intellectual curiosity. So I don't think we should say that this is in any way new either in theory or in practice.
No, I think Hofstadter is a very important voice. Actually, is the book that you mentioned, Anti-Intellectualism in American Way, really started out as an article for Harper's Magazine. And the reaction to it was of such enthusiastic interest and support that he turned it into a book pretty quickly the following year. And the argument is it's not only of interest for understanding what was going on in the 1960s when he wrote it, but it's another one of those prophetic books casting a bright light on long time trends in American academic life, American culture generally, that really have metastasized in our own time. But
the ethos of the self-made man, the democratic belief that everybody is equal, an inability to properly define elites. We think of elites as generally liberal, educated elites. We do not think of elites as billionaires who buy Supreme Court seats in Wisconsin with giant Ed McMahon kind of checks, but we're very suspicious of somebody with a PhD.
Yeah. Well, and of course that's really part of the whole conspiracy model of thinking about American politics, This is Hofstadter's point in that book, that there's this anti-intellectual, anti-elite current in American life. It is very deeply entrenched. It goes back, he traced it back to the very beginning of the country. And I think writers like Veblen and Hofstadter, others as well, but those two primarily, really deserve to be reread today to give us some idea of the origins of trends that had become dominant in our time. They're not just out there as possibilities. They are actualities. It's the world we're living in, where the study of history, the study of the humanities, had acquired a kind of negative aura in the thinking of vast numbers of the American people. And of course, this really reminds us of what James Madison said in Federalist Number 10 about how important it would be in order to keep our republic, as he was writing his essays in the Federalist Papers to defend the American Constitution of 1787. His essays were written the following year. It's very important to keep our republic, to keep our Constitution, for the American people to be literate and to be informed and to be actively engaged in the affairs of the country. I mean, to really know what's going on and to be studying up and reading up, almost as an obligation of citizenship. Because if the American people fail to keep up, if they lack this interest in knowing what actually is going on, if they succumb to this fantasy world of fiction rather than the truth, and we'll lose the republic. He makes that statement. We will lose this republic. And I think the danger of that happening now is right in front of our eyes.
I think that we have lost any willingness to adhere to some standard of truth. I think that it's just too easy to discount. I mean, we have people doing it in our government on an hourly basis now, where Kristi Noem can get in front of a Senate panel and completely fail to answer a simple question, what is habeas corpus? And before she can get to the car, the spin doctors have discounted that as some sort of liberal attack. And so, there's no standard of truth in anything, because the politic is more important than truth. In thinking about that, I tend to wander towards Orwell, the Ministry of Truth. I'm not entirely sure that's not the world we're living in by any means. There are a lot of differences that I think are very important. One of them being that Orwell's world in that novel was not devoid of sense to quite the extent that American political discussion has become. I think even Orwell would not understand how we could be so completely lost to the truth. Hofstadter, I think, certainly predicts some of this in a different way than Orwell, by more of a bottom-up cultural aversion to elites and intellect and things in that stripe. But we're in this situation where it's very hard to establish that, oh no, you said that, Oh, that happened. Those are basic tenets of being informed and having an informed society. Is, journalism is just fact, right? I mean, but if there are none, what point does journalism have, and how well informed can people be?
I'm glad that you raised Orwell's name. And 1984. It's a book not only for the late 1940s when he wrote it, but it's a book for today. And the main character in that novel, Winston Smith, works in the ministry truth. And Orwell was a fascinating character. He was a socialist, but of a non-Marxist variety. In fact, he was very much opposed to Marxists for various reasons that we don't have time to discuss fully today, but that's a very important thing to remember about him. But he was a socialist. He was a man of the left who thought that every society has a version of its own ministry of truth. And the role of the historian, I mean, the honest historian, the true historian, is to be testing the claims of the government, the claims of the elites who run society, against what they're actually doing, what their actual acts are. And I think that's another way of really getting at James Madison's point about how important a sound historical education is for citizenship. I think this is where historians continue to play a very important role in trying to show how their discipline, the discipline of historiography, really going back to Thucydides, remains the gold standard for understanding what is going on today. It's not a study just for the past. It's a study that can be applied to the present. The methodology can be applied to the present. Not just simply being deceived by the rhetoric of governments, but really developing the kind of insight into the way politics work, the way power works, so that one has a realistic sense instead of a fantasy-based sense of what's actually going on. I think Orwell's novel, which really has some important predecessors we could talk about, Yevgeny Zamyatin's We, a novel actually written in 1920, 1921, in the immediate aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, which deeply influenced Orwell. I mean, anyone who reads those two books back to back can readily see how much Orwell derived from Zamyatin. But Zamyatin absolutely fascinates me. He's just a truly remarkable genius, in my view. That novel is just a tower of insight and inspiration for other writers who came after him, Orwell included. That whole fear that Zamyatin describes in masterful detail of how governments in the modern world, as a result of technological refinements, is capable of completely destroying freedom. I mean, in fact, he describes the world in which D503 was the central character, in which the mathematician, a fascinating character, he describes that world as a land of unfreedom. And of course, the irony is that all the people in D503's world think that they are the most free, the most joyous, the most fulfilled generation in history, yet they're the most enslaved. This is a marvelous forecast, I think, of so many trends that we're talking about today, and how people can be lulled into a false sense of what's going on if they don't have a sound historical education. The question is, where does one get that? Right. And we could perhaps talk about that at some greater point. But I would just like to say this: as far as American historians go, I've been working on a book about William Appleman Williams, who was an arch left-wing revisionist in the second half of the 20th century. His great book, of course, is The Tragedy of American Diplomacy, published in 1959, brilliant book, and of lasting importance. But he was once asked, where does one go to get a sound education? A sound historical education. And he said, well, the place to begin, if you're looking for the most fruitful starting point, is Henry Adams, our greatest historian. And above all, The Education of Henry Adams, which he wrote very late in life. It was only published as a book after his death. But he tried to distill the essence of his understanding of what America was and what its great strengths were, what its great weaknesses were. There were plenty of both. And to be a soundly educated American citizen, one would have to be aware of both their strengths and the weaknesses. The problem with Trump's historical program for the American people is that he only wants to talk about its strengths. He doesn't want to talk about its weaknesses. He thinks this is un-American to talk about them. It might even be communistic to talk about them. And this, of course, is the gateway to ignorance. And the very consequences that James Madison and Thurston Vetland and the other worthies we've been talking about fear. And I'm afraid that we've come to a moment in American history where these chickens had come home to roost. They're right there on the perch, on the porch of our republic.
I am curious to have you address the topic of revisionism.
Yeah, let's do it.
You know, you've used that word. That is a word that's applied to a school of history.
More than one school. And I'll get into that.
Okay.
In my answer. So ask me the question.
Well, I'm curious to know if you can break that down a little bit, because I think many people hear a word like revisionism and they think of maybe a more Soviet style of top-down rewriting history. Oh, that never happened in the Ukraine, or, you know, that kind of model that we saw in Stalin. We're certainly seeing it with Putin. That's not the same as what we're speaking about.
Right. Well, revisionism is a complicated term. Historical revisionism includes a variety of currents, one of which we've just been talking about. I think right-wing populism is the tradition I think most people today would be thinking of in connection with revisionism when they hear that word. Or, as you just said,
A totalitarian.
yeah, going back to earlier period in which Orwell wrote his book and Zamyatin wrote his book, Soviet totalitarianism and other forms of totalitarian, the Nazi movement, fascist movement. There are many different varieties of that, which also were based on historical revisionism. But as William Appleman Williams, I have him in mind because I've recently completed a book about him, thought that it's very important to remember that revisionism has some beneficial currents as well, currents that really deserve careful study. In fact, his classic book, The Tragedy of American Diplomacy, published in 1959, was a revisionist critique of American foreign policy since the Spanish-American War of 1898. He thought that the claim of the government in our wars from 1898 down to the beginnings of Vietnam in the late 1950s, he could already see problems gathering over Vietnam that would explode in the American phase of the Vietnam War, following decade. He thought that the government's explanations for America's wars and principal foreign policy initiatives were really misrepresented. They were really about the spread of democracy and freedom and human rights. All that, he thought, was a mystification, concealing the real driving force, which was the launching and the spread of the American empire. American economic interests abroad were the main driving force of American foreign policy. It's a very important interpretation of American history. It's heatedly contested, but it's gained a very important foothold in scholarship. And so I think that would be an example of historical revisionism that should not be confused with the right-wing populist version or the totalitarian versions that we've been talking about. What Williams also thought with regard to historical revisionism, I think, is even better explained by a little-known historian, but he should be better known, in my view. His name is James J. Martin. And the title of his book, published in 1971, was Essays on Historical Revisionism, essays in a dissident historical tradition. And he makes this argument that historical revisionism, at its best, at its most intellectually honest and helpful for us as citizens, should be thought of as an attempt to look at that part of the historical record that is either ignored or de-emphasized by the status quo. That's a very important insight, I think. And to my mind, it rescues the term historical revisionism from these entirely negative associations which surround it.
Which is more a form of historical denialism than it is revisionism.
So it's a complex term. And another historian who really qualifies as a historical revisionist, in my view, one of the most gifted historians of his generation is Christopher Lasch, who's best known for his best-selling book, Cultured Narcissism, in 1979. That book was on the New York Times bestseller list for weeks. But another book that he wrote, I recently taught a seminar in which we read this book, is True and Only Heaven, which is a history of progress. And he writes about historical revisionism in there and really essentially says that historical revisionism is essential for testing the status quo. And the status quo, even ours, requires testing. Does it mean you reject it? Does it mean you dismiss it? But it means that you're constantly pressing, using the historical method, the search for evidence and applying logic to the evidence of any case under review, that this method has to be brought to bear for societies to remain true to the needs of their people and not to the elites who control the society. As the great English historian Lord Acton wrote, power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And you have to guard against that, including here in God's country. We have to guard against that. And historical revisionism carried out honestly is the best way to do that.
And that's a wrap. Cue the orchestra.